When the first anthology of Old Japanese poetry, the Manyoshu, was compiled, the most popular form of poetry was the tanka, or short poem. In the classical Japanese period, this popularity only increased further to the point where tanka and waka, Japanese poetry, practically became synonyms. Later, in the Muromachi and then Edo periods, the popularity of tanka declined in favor of first renga and then its child styles of haikai poetry like haiku or senryu, and it took the nationalist wave of the 19th century to bring tanka back into the spotlight. Since then, tanka have ebbed and flowed in popularity, but they have remained a constant in the Japanese cultural scene, so to say. And throughout all those centuries, the basic form of the tanka has remained pretty much the same. You have 5 lines of 5, 7, 5, 7, and 7 again, metrical units. What those metrical units are changed throughout the years, but let's not dwell on that for too long. And also you can have one metrical unit more or less in some lines under some circumstances. This remarkable constancy over the years allows us to compare poems from very different time periods. So for example, here we have a modern tanka from the 1980s, here a classical Japanese tanka from around the year 1000, and here we have an old Japanese tanka from the Manyoshu. Without even looking at the language, the first thing that should catch your eye is how they are written, and that the classical Japanese poem and the modern Japanese poem, despite being about 1000 years apart, look remarkably similar, at least compared to the old Japanese one, which looks very, very different. If you know just modern Japanese, you might even think that the old Japanese poem is actually Chinese. Unless you also know Chinese, then you immediately recognize that this would be complete gibberish in Chinese. The reason why the old Japanese poem looks so different from the later ones is obviously the lack of kana, at least in the conventional sense of hiragana in the case of the classical Japanese poem and of hiragana and katakana in the case of the modern one. But if you look a bit deeper, the way they are written is actually not so different after all. And that's what I want to explore in this video. Welcome to dokudenpa, my name is Philipp Hinrichs, I am a PhD student of Japanese language and literature, and this channel is dedicated to exploring topics in Japanese linguistics. In this case, Old Japanese linguistics. First of all, we have to talk about writing more generally, and about 2 different types of writing: phonographic and morphographic. Phonographic writing means that the writing represents units of phonology, like sounds or syllables or something like that. And morphographic writing means that it represents morphological units like morphemes or words. Morphographic writing is often called logographic, which means writing words, and the problem, as we will see specifically with Japanese, is that it's not only complete words that are written. More often it's parts of words or even just something like suffixes. So that's why I don't use logographic. The prime example for phonographic writing is of course alphabetic writing systems, like the one of English, as weird and flawed as it is. And the prime example for morphographic writing is Chinese. But no writing system in the world is purely phonographic or purely morphographic. So, for example, in English, you have stuff like the and sign, which definitely represents the word and, or you have the cipher 1, which represents 1, or maybe the fur in first, or you can have two ciphers like 1 and 2, and then they together represent the word 12. Stuff like that exists pretty much in every phonographic system. In Chinese, obviously, you also have phonographic uses of the Chinese characters. For example, if you want to transliterate a foreign name, we will see that that's a very important principle for Japanese as well. But nevertheless, most writing systems are either predominantly phonographic or predominantly morphographic. And that's where Japanese is such an interesting exception, because Japanese has a pretty good division of labor between the two systems, which is reflected, in modern Japanese at least, in the division of labor between the three main scripts, between kanji on the one side, which are usually morphographic, and kana on the other side, hiragana and katakana, which are predominantly phonographic. So, as an example, let's look at that modern Japanese poem again. Like I said, this is a modern tanka. It is by Tawada Machi, who is perhaps Japan's most famous contemporary tanka poet, and it is the poem that lent its name to her first anthology, called Sarada Kinembi, published in 1987. And this is credited with starting a kind of tanka boom in Japan in the late 80s. And because of that, this is probably the most famous tanka of the last 50 years or so. So, in my terrible accent, this is Kono aji ga ine tokimi ga ittakara shichigatsu muika wa Sarada Kinembi. And not only did I pronounce that as terribly as I usually pronounce Japanese, I also overstressed the line breaks and the metrical structure, which you are not usually supposed to do for poetry, but which makes us see this is a very regularly structured tanka with 5, 7, 5, 7. Well, that was a blunder. Yeah, seemingly I can't count. This is 8 morae, so a giamari. 7 morae, or haku in Japanese, which is the modern Japanese metrical unit. And not only is the structure very normal, this is also very normal, everyday modern Japanese. There's not much poetic flourish going on in the language. If you're learning Japanese, you might recognize this as very basic, like N5 type grammar. There's not much challenging stuff going on in the language department. Translated into English, this would be something like, because you said this taste is nice, the 6th of July is Salad Day, or literally Salad Memorial Day, but or something like that. But there's a bit more going on than meets the eye. They're not actually eating salad, and Salad Day is a metaphor. And well, yeah, I'm not going to go into that because that's not my forte, and I'd much rather talk about the way that this is written. And this is also written in a way that is very normal for modern Japanese. And not only modern Japanese poetry, but just modern Japanese in general. This is pretty much how you learn to write Japanese, with a mix of hiragana, katakana, and kanji, with very clearly defined roles. So let's start out with the kanji. And like most kanji in modern Japanese texts, all kanji in this poem are morphographs. So they basically represent morphemes. But not just any and all kinds of morphemes, but rather, as a general rule of thumb, in modern Japanese, kanji only represent lexical elements instead of grammatical ones. Now, this distinction between lexical and grammatical is a bit vague and mostly semantics based, but it often overlaps with the distinction between free and bound morphemes. Free morphemes are what makes up the core of a word, so it's either, in the case of nouns for example, just the whole word, or in the case of verbs or adjectives, it's the verb stem. And the bound morphemes are the suffixes or particles, which are used to either derive new words from that or to inflect them grammatically. So generally free morphemes are often lexical and bound morphemes are often grammatical, but whether a specific morpheme is spelled with kanji or not is more often just based on its meaning, as we will see shortly. Now, as a second rule of thumb, kanji represent as much of a morpheme as is reasonably possible. And in the simplest case of nouns like aji or kimi here, that's just the whole word. So, for example, our kimi here is represented by this kanji, which could only represent this kimi, kimi meaning you. As you probably know, there are like 20 ways to say you in Japanese, and this is one of them, a pretty intimate one at that. And kimi can only represent this kimi and not, for example, kimi as in feeling or kimi as an egg yolk. And that's all of the homophones I could think of for kimi. But obviously not all cases of kanji morphography are that simple. And for that, let's look at this date here. Shichigatsu Muika, the 6th of July. The first kanji of each word are relatively trivial morphographs. These just represent the numbers 7 and 6 respectively. And in fact, you could even spell those as Arabic numerals and it wouldn't really change anything. What is far more interesting is the kanji following those numbers, representing gatsu and ka respectively, month and day. And neither of those are free morphemes, but because of what they mean, they are nevertheless understood as lexical and thus represented with kanji in pretty much all cases. Now, this is also a good moment to introduce the concept of onyomi and kunyomi, or Sino-Japanese and native vocabulary. So, over the centuries, the Japanese lexicon has had a lot of influence from Chinese, in various forms, but mostly from classical Chinese with Middle Chinese pronunciations. And this is comparable to how Latin and Greek have influenced the lexicon of many European languages, like English, just far more extreme. This includes many direct loanwords from classical Chinese, but it also goes a bit further, because you can also coin new words using the building blocks of those loanwords, without those building blocks necessarily being words in and of themselves. And those building blocks are the kanji with Japanese pronunciations based on their Middle Chinese pronunciations, which is called onyomi, literally reading by pronunciation. Collectively, all the vocabulary derived from classical Chinese is called Sino-Japanese. Or in Japanese, it's called kango, literally just meaning Chinese words. And opposite of this, of course, is the native Japanese vocabulary. Or in Japanese, it's wago, literally just Japanese words. Or if you want to be really fancy, Yamato kotoba. And if you represent native Japanese vocabulary in kanji, this is called kunyomi, literally reading by translation. So this means that you use the kanji to represent the Japanese word that has roughly the same meaning as the Chinese word that character was originally used to represent in Chinese, which as an explanation sounds more complicated than it actually is. So the Middle Chinese word for moon or month, which this character was used to write, was something like ngot. And that's where we get this modern Japanese pronunciation, this onyomi of gatsu. Now, this is a bit of a special case though, because usually there are two different onyomi, two different Sino-Japanese borrowings for each kanji. And these were borrowed at different points of time from slightly different Middle Chinese dialects. These are the goong, which is the older one, and the kangong, which is the newer and usually more common one. In the case of this kanji, of this Middle Chinese word, the goong is gachi, and that has pretty much died out. That's only used in some few historical terms. And the kangong is getsu, and that's the one that you usually encounter when you see Sino-Japanese words spelled with this kanji. So like mangetsu, full moon, or getsuyobi, Monday. And the gatsu is a third kind of pronunciation called kanyon, which literally means customary pronunciation. And that's a nice way of saying wrong pronunciation, essentially. So at some point, probably people confused the gachi and the getsu and mixed them up, and as a result, started pronouncing a few words with gatsu. And these are, I think, just the names of the months, so Ichigatsu, Nigatsu, Sangatsu, and so on. And Shogatsu, which means New Year. This kanji also has a kunyomi, of course, which is tsuki, which is the native Japanese word for moon or month. And of course, it makes sense why you would use that character to spell that word. They are essentially direct translation equivalents. The months used to have native Japanese names as well. We see those still sometimes in poetic language, but in everyday speech or writing, they have pretty much been completely abandoned in favor of the Sino-Japanese names, which are just a Sino-Japanese number plus gatsu. The days of the month are a completely different beast though, because here we have a wild mix of native Japanese and Sino-Japanese that has been the despair of many a student of Japanese. So days 2 to 10 are native Japanese, and all those past that are Sino-Japanese. except for 20, which is native Japanese again, and 14 and 24, which are a mix of Sino-Japanese and native Japanese. Like I said, pretty wild. The sixth day, Muika, is in the native Japanese category, and so we are dealing with a kunyomi, but not with a perfectly unproblematic one. Because, well, the native Japanese word that this kanji usually represents is hi, which means sun or day, and which we in fact see in later in this poem in Kinembi, Memorial Day. But additionally, there's a second kunyomi, or what is traditionally considered a second kunyomi, which is this ka. And in Old Japanese and in Classical Japanese, this was a suffix to derive counted days from native Japanese numerals. And the problem is just that those native Japanese numerals have largely been replaced by Sino-Japanese numerals. So you still count with native Japanese numerals, you still have hitotsu, futatsu, mitsu, yotsu, itsutsu, mutsu, and so on. And you still have those names for the days. And we also have some very few suffixes that combine with those native Japanese numerals. But compared to those forms, the names for the days with ka seem pretty irregular in a way that cannot be explained easily, which is only made worse by the fact that we have so very few forms in the first place. This means that it's pretty much impossible to understand the mue in muika as an allomorph of the mu in, for example, mutsu. Yeah, they are obviously related etymologically, but not in any way that is understandable in the contemporary language. Instead, you would say that what was originally two morphemes now just forms one fossilized word, one monomorphemic word. And this means that the kanji no longer represent two separate morphemes, but instead two kanji together represent one morpheme. And so you would say it's not a kanji or a Arabic numeral for that matter, which represents mui, and a second kanji representing ka, but those two together represent muika. Still, this is not too much of a problem. As I said, many of the onyomi are not autonomous morphemes either, and so you could say, well, this is just a special kunyomi for this six kanji, which just happens to only occur in front of this kanji for day. And well, that's the way they do it in Japanese schools, and it works out perfectly fine. But you still have definite cases where two kanji together have to be interpreted as just one word without being able to separate them. And a topical example for that would be the first day of a month, which is tsuitachi. And this doesn't have anything to do with first or day. Instead, it's derived from this word for month we had earlier, this tsuki, combined with tatsu, the verb meaning in this case to begin. So it's the beginning of a month, and still it's spelled with the kanji for first and day. And so these two kanji together have to be taken to represent this word together. And this is called jukuji-kun, which means combined character kunyomi. And it's something that we will see a lot more of in Old Japanese. So let's move on to phonography and to the kana scripts. There's two of them, hiragana and katakana, and in modern Japanese texts, hiragana is usually the main one. At least since the spelling reforms of 1946, kana represent Japanese phonology in a pretty regular way, at least compared to some other writing systems. Now, there's a bit of controversy about what kana represent at the most fundamental level, what phonological unit, but I like to just explain it this way. In most cases, single kana represent open, short syllables, like a, I, u, e, o, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko, and so on. There are digraphs to represent syllables with palatalized onsets, like kya, kyu, kyo, sha, shu, sho, and so on, as well as with foreign onset sounds in loanwords. Then there's two kana symbols to represent the codas of closed syllables, and long vowels are marked either by adding an additional vowel symbol or by adding the special lengthening sign called the choompu, the letter of which is more common with katakana. Like I said before, grammatical elements are usually not represented in kanji. Instead, they are written in hiragana. So, a very simple example for that would be particles, which are clitics, so a form of bound morpheme. And so, for example, we have this ga, which marks the nominative case, and this is represented by the hiragana ga, which just represents the sound ga and has no special relation to this morpheme. We also have this kono here, meaning this, which is a free morpheme, an adnoun to be precise, but because its semantics is very grammatical, being a demonstrative and all, it is nevertheless represented with hiragana. And those hiragana are the hiragana for ko and the hiragana for no. Very simple. Additionally, you can of course represent any word you want phonographically in kana, but in practice there are some clear tendencies. So again, the more something looks grammatical rather than lexical, the more likely you are to spell it in hiragana rather than kanji. So for example, there's this noun, toki, which means time, and if you use it to refer to time, then you usually spell it in kanji, because it's very lexical, nouny then. But you can also use it kind of like a conjunction to mean when or while, and then you see it also spelled with kana quite often. And there are quite a few examples like that, where you have the same word both as a content word written in kanji and as a function word more written in kana. Then you can also choose to write something in kana because the kanji are just too complicated. This can of course be complicated in the sense that you don't know the kanji, or you expect that the reader doesn't know the kanji. Or it can be complicated just in the sense that you are handwriting and you don't want to write that complicated kanji. And that was quite a common issue back when handwriting was still a common thing. And because of that, the introduction of computers has probably increased the amount of kanji in average Japanese texts by quite a bit. Or maybe you have a word that is represented by a kanji that can also represent other words, and you want to be very specific in what you mean, and then you can just spell it out phonographically to be very precise. And we kind of have something like that going on here. So this adjective e, which means good, has a kanji associated with it, but it's rarely used for it because you usually use that kanji to represent yoi, which is the kind of proper formal form for E, and E is a kind of contraction that is not really colloquial anymore. It's just a more normal form today, but it used to be colloquial, and you still just usually write E with kana instead of kanji, because otherwise people might think you mean yoi. And that would definitely give the that would definitely give the poem a different vibe if it was yoi. But there's also words that you just have to spell phonographically simply because there's no established morphographic representation for them. And in modern Japanese, the prime example for that is of course loanwords. Loanwords from other languages than classical Chinese, that is, which are called gaidaigo and are our third major group of vocabulary besides wago and kango. The one gaidaigo in this poem is of course sarada, which means salad, and is also derived either from English salad or from its French cognate salade. Now, this is represented here phonographically, but not in hiragana, but in katakana. And you often hear that katakana are just the script for representing foreign words in Japanese. And in this case, it's of course true that it is representing a foreign word. But I would say that this is a sort of massive oversimplification. Because I would rather explain it in this way. Between your two kana scripts, your hiragana and katakana, in modern day texts, hiragana are the default main phonographic script. And that was a role that, by the way, katakana could also regularly take up before 1945 or so. But today, katakana are left in this kind of secondary role as an extra phonographic script. And you can use that extra phonographic script in a kind of similar way to how you would use italics in English. So you can use it to put a stress on certain words, or to indicate that they are pronounced in a kind of weird way, or to mark onomatopoeia, or to mark foreign words. And while all those uses of italics in English are more or less optional, in Japanese that last one has become mandatory. And so we end up with foreign words being represented by katakana all the time. And then you also have many words for which you use a mix of both morphography and phonography. So, as I said before, kanji usually represent as much of the morpheme they are supposed to represent as is reasonably possible. And in the case of verbs, that means pretty much most of the verb stem. But verbs in Japanese are always inflected. And so in addition to that verb stem, you also need some inflectional suffix. And because you don't really represent those in morphographs anymore in modern Japanese, you also have to add hiragana. These kana are called okurigana, and they are most prevalent, as I said, in those inflected word forms. But you can also have them here and there in uninflected word forms like nouns, nominal adjectives, adverbs, to mark that those kanji represent this word and not that other one. The only verb in this poem is itta, which is the past tense form of you, which means to say. And if you compare those two, you immediately see they share the same kanji representing their verb stem, but have different okudigana, different hiragana at the end representing their inflectional suffixes. And that's how you represent the verb inflection in modern Japanese writing. You use the same kanji, but you switch out the hiragana to represent those different inflectional suffixes. Pretty simple. So if we were, for example, to do the negated form, the negated present tense form, iwanai, different kana. And because of the syllable structure of Japanese, and especially of Japanese phonography, clashing with its morphology, you get those situations where you have the last little part of consonantal stem verbs represented phonographically instead of as part of the stem they belong to. So for example, this w at the iwanai, that's still part of the stem, but you have to represent it phonographically because you couldn't do it any other way. Okay, let's move on to the classical Japanese poem. And this one is by Koshikibu no Naishi, who was a court lady at the height of the Heian period. And this is my favorite poem from the Oguda Hyakunin issue, which is a compilation of 100 poems by 100 famous poets, compiled by Fujiwara no Teika at the beginning of the Kamakura period, so at the very end of classical Japanese, more or less. And it's very famous because it's the basis for the game of Karuta. So I would pronounce this a bit like this. Ofoyeyama ikuno no michi no tofo kerema mana fumi mo minzu ama no fashin nate. And this is probably a lot different than they would have pronounced it. It is certainly different from how it is sung in modern day karuta contests, but we really don't know much about the development of classical Japanese phonology, especially in the realm of poetry, where everything was a bit more archaic than in the realms where we do have some evidence. I would perhaps translate this as because the way across Mount Oe and the fields of Iku is long, I have not even seen a letter yet, nor tried to step foot on Amanohashidate. And the core kind of poetic trick here is that there's a pun between fumimiru, to see a letter, and fumimiru, to try to step on. And this is a common kind of thing in classical Japanese poetry. There's often this punning and double meaning. They really like that far more than what you see in old Japanese poetry. So the context for this is that the poet was asked before a poetry contest whether she had asked her famous mother, Izumi Shikibu, for help. And as a response, she essentially said, "No way, my parents live in Tango right now, near Amanohashidate. That's far away. I haven't been there. I haven't even gotten a letter, so shut up." And because she said that by composing a perfectly composed tanka on the spot, she also proved that she didn't need her mother's help anyway, and essentially proved her haters wrong. Awesome. There are various different versions of the Hyakunin issue in regard to how the poems are represented in writing. The earliest one we have is actually in 100% hiragana, which is pretty common for classical Japanese poetry generally. But the one I chose is a mix of kanji and hiragana, and it is from the Kacho Hyakunin issue. This is a Edo period edition of the Hyakunin issue with illustrations. That was very popular and also pretty influential in the realm of karuta. And despite this being printed 500 years after the Hyakunin issue was first compiled, and maybe 800 years after this poem was first composed, I still think this is a pretty good representation of how pre-modern interplay of morphography and phonography worked. Generally, the situation here is very similar to our modern Japanese poem. We have morphographic kanji and phonographic hiragana, and the latter are consistently used to represent the very grammatical elements like particles or inflectional suffixes. One big difference, though, is that in pre-modern Japanese writing, there's far more of a willingness to also represent lexical elements that have an established morphographic representation, phonographically nevertheless. So, for example, we have these two place names here, which are written in a mix of phonography and morphography, ama no hashidate, and this is something that you would never see in modern Japanese texts. You would choose one or the other, morphography or phonography, but you wouldn't mix them in a single place name. Especially not ones which have very well known and pretty easy to read representations morphographically. The reason for choosing hiragana in these cases seems to be mostly aesthetic. There's a very distinct look to how Japanese poems were written down, and that is really defined by the very simple flowing shapes of hiragana, as opposed to maybe some other text types where you really reveled in having tons of super complicated kanji one after the other. And for that reason, you would often just prefer using hiragana over kanji, especially over kanji that were more complicated, had more strokes, like maybe our hashi here, and thus might have broken up that visual aesthetic you were going for. And without our orthographic sensibilities today that you have to spell names in a certain way, there was nothing to hinder those visually aesthetic sensibilities. In short, there were less rules, you had more freedom, hence also all those different versions. Otherwise, there's really nothing here that we haven't already seen in the modern Japanese. As was our initial impression, they're pretty similar with the mix of kanji and kana. And so we can finally move on to our main attraction, the old Japanese poem, and see what all the kanji are about. So this is poem 285 of the Mayoshu. 285 means that it is found in the second book of the Mayoshu and that it is the 85th poem overall. It doesn't mean that it is the 85th poem in the second book. Actually, it is the first poem in the second book. But, well, that numbering system is a bit confusing, but it is the standard way we cite the Mayoshu. The poem is ascribed to Empress Iwahime, or Iwanohime, who was supposedly the wife of Emperor Nintoku. So this would date the poem to about the 5th century. The problem is just that Emperor Nintoku is one of those semi-legendary early emperors, and so we can't really trust the traditional historiography, including the attribution of some poem 300 years later. I would read this as Kimi ga yuki kei nanaku narinu yamatando ne mukape ka yukamu mati ni ka matamu. And with that, for the third time, we have a very nice tanka with a structure of 75777 syllables in this case instead of morae, because in Old Japanese morae didn't exist yet, but that's a story for another day. And I would perhaps translate this as, since you are gone, the days have grown long. Should I go out to the mountains to meet you, or should I just wait and wait? So this is pretty direct and straightforward, especially compared to that classical Japanese one with the wordplay and double meaning and so on. And that's generally the rule for old Japanese poetry. The language is usually pretty direct, it's just the writing that totally isn't. So let's talk about that. So we have a wall of kanji here, and that is pretty intimidating at first. But behind that intimidating facade, it really is not all that different from what we've seen with modern and with classical Japanese. So we still have morphography and phonography. It's just that we cannot distinguish between them visually immediately because they are both in kanji. This is of course simply because kana, as in hiragana and katakana, were simply not invented yet. They were creations of the early Heian period, so pretty much coincided with the beginning of classical Japanese. And in Old Japanese, we only have a kind of pseudo form of kana, which is Maiyogana. And Maiyogana, named of course after the Maiyoshu, the book we are reading right now, is just the name for using kanji phonographically. This is of course the origin of all phonographic writing. At the beginning they only had kanji, and hiragana and katakana are really just abbreviated, simplified forms of those kanji that kind of lost their kanjiness and in the end became only usable for phonography. But at their core, there's still some kanji hiding behind those modern kana forms. After seeing enough old Japanese texts, these become pretty easy to recognize, but you can also pretty easily recognize them from context. So this character here in Chinese is used to represent a word meaning to pile on top, or to add, or to increase. And in Japanese it is used to morphographically represent a word that means pretty much the same, which is kawaeru in modern Japanese or kupapu in old Japanese. But additionally, it has also for a very long time been used phonographically, including in Chinese. So for example, the name of Canada in Chinese is still spelled with this character. This is still from the time when it was pronounced with a k at the beginning and not a j, like in modern standard Chinese. So the Japanese did not invent using this character for syllables that sound something like ka, which is of course what it represents in Old Japanese, a ka. And this is what it still represents because this Maiyogana is of course the origin of both our hiragana ka and our katakana ka, which is one of the more obvious kana kanji correspondences, I would say. So if you see this character in an old Japanese text, you might have to think about, does this look like it has something to do with adding or increasing? Then it might be used morphographically for kupapu. And if it doesn't, then it's probably used phonographically as ka, which is really most of the time. Some of these Maiyogana are easier to recognize than others. So for example, we have this nu here, which could morphographically represent a word meaning slave, but they are not talking about slavery that often in these poems, so we can be pretty sure whenever we see it to interpret it phonographically just as a nu. On the other hand, there's this character here, which is used to phonographically represent ka as well. But but it could also represent the adjective beshi morphographically, and beshi is pretty damn common in old Japanese poems, so you have to be a bit careful to look what it is more likely to be in the context. One thing that all of these Mayogana have in common is that their phonographic representation is based on the Middle Chinese pronunciation of these characters. This is of course similar to the onyomi we had before, but not quite, because onyomi didn't exist in Old Japanese yet, and for the simple reason that Sino-Japanese didn't exist in Old Japanese yet. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't any Chinese loanwords. We can be pretty sure that, for example, uma, horse, is a Chinese loanword. There's no way that they would have made up a word for horse that sounds so similar to the Chinese word for horse when horses were introduced to Japan from the continent, and we know that. And it's just that the systematic adaptation through a system of phonological correspondence that modern day onyomi didn't exist yet. So, for example, one of the most common Mayogana for ra is this one here. And it's the one in nada, for example, and it's also the one that both our modern day hiragana and katakana are based on. And if you know this character, it means something like good. It represents morphographically yoi, that one that we didn't use for the e before. The Middle Chinese word that this represented was liang, meaning something like good, and you see that it's a pretty big step going from liang to ra, a pretty big simplification, which makes sense though considering Old Japanese syllable structure. But then, as we start getting proper Sino-Japanese vocabulary in classical Japanese, we see more faithful adaptations of this phonological shape. So the gong used to be rao, becoming modern day ro, and then even more faithfully the kangong was riao, becoming modern day ryo, which is the standard pronunciation for this character in Sino-Japanese today. But nevertheless, as these Mayogana are still based on the Middle Chinese in the last regard, we nevertheless call these ongana, so sound kana. And if there's ongana, there's also kungana, which are based on the Old Japanese translation of these Middle Chinese words and how they are pronounced. So we essentially have a form of rebus writing within Old Japanese there. Now, kungana are a later innovation. We don't see them in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, and they're also a lot more rare than ongana overall. But nevertheless, you see them from time to time, and it can be a bit of a problem if you've already recognized that something is not morphographic, if you still have to decide whether the phonographic representation is based on the Middle Chinese or the Old Japanese. So, for example, this character here was pronounced Mao in Middle Chinese, and from that we get the ongana mo. This Middle Chinese word means hair, and so the kunyomi of it, still in modern day Japanese as well, is ke or kei in Old Japanese. And because of that, it is also used as a kungana for kei. So if you see this, you have to decide, is this a mo or is this a kei? Even if it's not the K that means hair in this specific case. even if it's not morphographic. So in the end, the mo was a lot more popular than the ke for this one, and for that reason it is the origin of our modern day mo kana, both of them. Additionally, much like later hiragana and katakana, all of the mayogana in this poem represent one syllable each. And this is the case for most phonographs in Old Japanese, but not for all. So, for example, you also have characters that represent two syllables at once. For example, this one here usually morphographically represents turu, crane, but it can also be used as a kungana for the two syllables turu. Now, incidentally, the only context in which this occurs, besides the crane, of course, is in the adnominal perfective inflection, turu, which makes this almost like a morphograph by proxy again. But this is just due to the fact that there aren't that many cases in which we have the sounds turu in a Japanese word together. So all a bit complicated, but what are you gonna do? On the other hand, we also have sometimes two characters together representing only one syllable. And most of these cases fall into the category of silly word games that in Japanese is called gisho. A simple example would be this here. We have 2 times the character for two, representing the syllable si. Why do they represent the syllable si? Well, because the Middle Chinese word for is si, and for that reason we use the character for as an ongana for si, and well, 2 times 2 is 4, so why not just use 2 times 2 to spell si? There's, of course, examples that are a lot more interesting and complicated, but they're probably worth another video or two. I don't know. Well, these really aren't the norm, and most of what we see in mayogana is really these two pretty simple categories of ongana and kungana, both monosyllabic, which is pretty much the same as we see with our modern day kana. And so for that reason, why not just for simplicity's sake change the mayogana we have in this poem to their modern day kana equivalents. And we see there's still more kanji than we might expect in a modern day text. So what is going on here? So let's start from the top. First line, we have 3 characters. The first we can maybe recognize from our modern Japanese poem. This is kimi. In modern Japanese, this just means you. The original meaning in Old Japanese is something like lord. So it's more like my lord. It's, you wouldn't say this to your friend. This is what Iwahime here uses to address her husband, who is also the emperor, so a bit more fitting. And this is just plain old normal morphography as we see in modern Japanese. So what about the second character? Well, this is actually one of the most interesting characters in all of old Japanese writing, because it can represent a whole lot of different things, which stems from the fact that it can mean a lot of different things in Chinese. So it can be used as a demonstrative, for example, and for that reason it can be used in Japanese to represent ke or kure, like the ancestor of modern day kore. It can be used as a verb, meaning to go. So it can be used to represent the verb yuku, to go. Or it can be used as something like a genitive marker in Chinese. And so it can be used to represent the more or less genitive particle in Old Japanese. Or genitive particles rather, because in Old Japanese there's two of them, n and nga, and in this case it's nga. Now this is something that we wouldn't see in modern Japanese, a particle being represented morphographically, because you pretty much can't go more grammatical than a particle. But in Old Japanese, they really didn't think about this. And it's pretty much equally as likely to have this kind of genitive particle represented phonographically as morphographically. And even after Old Japanese, this is probably one of the morphographs for a particle that survived the longest, like for the next 1,000 years or so in some cases. Our third character here represents a verb, yuku, go, which, as you might remember, can also be represented by that character we just had before, but no, in this case it's represented by the same character that is still commonly used to represent it today. So what's interesting here is not so much the choice of kanji, but rather the lack of okurigana. Because this form here, yuki, it can be either a nominalization or an adverbial form, but it would be spelled either way as yuki with a phonographic key at the end in modern Japanese, to mark that this is a yuki and not, for example, a yuku. Now, you wouldn't do this in Old Japanese though, because there's just some forms that you pretty much never explicitly mark. And this is mainly the adverbial form / nominalization, this E form, and the final form and the adnominal form, which are, well, the most important forms and the ones that don't really have Chinese equivalents, and so they mostly didn't bother, and you kind of have to infer it from context. Moving on to the second line, we start with a mayogana k, which here represents a noun k, which is a pretty lexical item. In fact, this is the independent morpheme equivalent of that suffix ka, de, we have already seen in the modern Japanese poem. And this word pretty much died out after Old Japanese. It's already pretty rare in Old Japanese compared to P, the ancestor of modern day he, of course. And that might well explain why the author chose to write this phonographically instead of morphographically. Because if it had been written morphographically with that character for day or sun we have already seen, it might just well have been confused with P. They are both monosyllabic after all, they both fit the metrical pattern of this poem. So it might have been preferable to spell the less popular choice of word explicitly phonographically. Although, of course, we will never know for certain. Moving on, we have an adjective, nangaku, written with the same kanji that is still used to write it today. And again, we see that the inflection, which would in modern Japanese be written in okurigana, just isn't written here at all. For adjectives as well as for verbs, the final, adnominal, and adverbial forms are often just unmarked. And here we know that it is nangaku, the adverbial form, because it is immediately followed by a verb. And a verb that is very typical for following adjectives. This is naru, become, and it is spelled morphographically with, again, the same kanji that is pretty much used to spell the descendant of this word in modern Japanese. Now, this is a word that is, in this context, after an adjective, often written phonographically in modern Japanese, because it's kind of a grammatical use to become whatever the adjective says. In this case, because nangaku means long, it's become long. But here we see, well, the old Japanese writers didn't care about that. They just wrote it morphographically because why wouldn't they? In contrast to the previous verb, as well as to that adjective, we here have something like okurigana though. And this is this phonograph nu we have already talked about, which here represents the perfective suffix nu. So this is something that is often spelled out explicitly, likely because it really changes the meaning of the verb from to become long to have become long, in contrast to those different forms that mostly go unmarked, which are really just differences in syntactic alignment. So the writers kind of felt necessary to inform us that here this is perfective, or rather perfect maybe. Actually the terminology for what this suffix means is kind of horrible. Well, it can mean something like a past tense, like something that has become completed, so like a perfect tense in English. It can also be just something like emphasis, like to really belong. Yeah. The third line starts out pretty unspectacular. Yama is pretty much the same word as in modern Japanese, meaning mountain, and is also written with the same character as in modern Japanese. Then we have tandune, a verb in the adverbial form, meaning something like to search a place, so searching in the mountains, and this is written phonographically. There was a morphographic representation for that as well, already in Old Japanese, but for some reason the author chose to write this phonographically instead. In the next line we start out with another adverbial verb, this time represented morphographically again, and again without the inflection represented in any way. This is mukape, meaning something like to go towards, or maybe to meet, and this is followed by the question particle ka, represented phonographically. After this we encounter the verb yuku, to go again, but this time in the form yukamu, which is what I would call the future form. Other people might disagree with that label though, but anyway, this is here represented in two kanji, and the second one of those we have already seen. This is what is usually used to represent yuku, but the first one is here used to represent that this is the future. Now, this seems a bit strange because Japanese uses suffixes to modify verbs, and in this case as well, it's amu, marking the future, being suffixed to the verb stem yuk. But in the writing, we have the morphograph representing that this is the future, preceding the one representing the verb. And this is simply because, well, in Chinese, we have a future marker represented by that exact character, which always comes before the verb. And so if you want to say going to go in Chinese, you are going to put that future marker before the verb, and In Japanese they thought, oh, we want to write going to go, and so they wrote this as one block, borrowing the Chinese way of writing it, although the morphology is exactly reverse. Or well, maybe not morphology in the case of Chinese, but syntax, but still same principle. And this is pretty common in Old Japanese morphography in general. There's just some suffixes that are usually, when represented morphographically, represented by putting something in front of the morphograph for the verb itself. So, for example, the negation, anzu or anu, those are pretty much always in morphography represented by putting this Chinese negation marker in front of the verb. At the same time, this isn't just some translation, because the Chinese future marker here and the Japanese future suffix amu actually have pretty different meanings. So while the Chinese one pretty much only refers to the future, as in something is going to happen, the Japanese amu also has a wide range of other functions, like speculation or wishes or suggestions. And so in this case it means something like should I go, which to my knowledge is something that wouldn't work with the Chinese that is ostensibly written here. So in this case, they took the closest thing that Chinese had to their own morpheme to represent this, but they weren't bothered when it didn't work as an actual translation. Once they had their morphograph, they could use it however they wanted. And to wrap this up, the last line starts with mati, verb meaning to wait, here in a nominalized form, represented morphographically without any marked inflection, followed by the particle ni, which is a dative or locative particle represented phonographically, and then this question particle ka again, represented phonographically but with a different phonograph than in the line before. This is something that's pretty common in Old Japanese. They don't like to repeat phonographs very much, why ever that is. And then we have the same verb matu again, but here in the future form again and represented by the same morphographic style as we have already seen with yukamu. So this then means something like, or should I wait while waiting, in waiting, so repeating this matu, wait, to show how bad the waiting actually is. This is a pretty good poem to represent how the writing in the Manyoshu works. So we have seen that morphography, as well as phonography, but especially morphography, though being essentially the same concept as in modern Japanese, still works quite a bit different from how it does in modern Japanese or even classical Japanese. Now there's also a much greater range of morphography to phonography in Old Japanese. So on one end of the spectrum we have hentai kanbun, which ideally has 100% morphography, with phonography at best used for some names or something, though in practice the hentai kanbun texts from Old Japanese that we have all have some extra phonography as well. And on the other end of the spectrum, the poems in, for example, the Kojiki or Nihon Shoki are written in 100% phonographs and also 100% ongana. No kungana seemingly invented yet. This large split is something that would persist into classical Japanese as well. So we still have a lot of hentai kanbun there, written morphographically, And as I've already said, for our classical Japanese poem, we have a lot of poems written just 100% in phonographic hiragana. What is remarkable though about the Old Japanese, and especially about the Manyoshu, is that the poems there really span the whole range. So from something that is 100% phonographically to something that is practically hentai kanbun, although poems are not called that, and everything in between, we have a poem in the Manyoshu pretty much. And that is something that we really don't see again in later Japanese stages. So yeah, you have texts that have a lot of phonography, or you have texts that have a lot of morphography, but just this complete freedom to pick and choose whatever you want for your specific poem, as well as all those weird kinds of phonographic spellings, as well as morphographic spellings that I haven't even talked about. Those are things that we never again see after Old Japanese. And yeah, this is why Old Japanese is great. In addition to this kind of puzzle aspect of trying to figure out what the actual connection between the writing and the language is. I'm going to put off all of the fun morphography for later though, when we look in some more detail at hentai kanbun. At first, I want to delve a bit deeper into the Manyogana and look at what they might tell us about Old Japanese phonology. That's a topic for the next video. If you're interested in that, tune in again to dokudenpa. Well, that took way too long, both to produce and just as a video probably. Yeah, I felt like I needed some preliminaries before jumping into the Old Japanese, and so I started with the basics of what is Japanese writing, what is morphography, what is phonography, and maybe I overdid it a little bit. Probably definitely with the classical Japanese. That really was a tangent that wasn't necessary at all. Yeah, at the end I just wanted to give a few notes, literature recommendations, and for the main topic of this video, really the main piece of literature that I would recommend is, as I already did in the first video, Bjarke Frederiksvik's History of the Japanese Language. It's chapter 1.1 on Old Japanese writing that really deals with pretty much what I dealt with in the second half of this video, just in far greater detail and with a lot more examples and numbers and interesting stuff. Yeah, I can really just recommend that wholeheartedly, and otherwise there's a lot of chapters, articles on, well, introductions to Old Japanese writing or even Japanese writing more generally. And the thing about those is they all pretty much use the same examples and comparisons, and for that reason I don't really know if I can recommend any of them so wholeheartedly. Probably the grandfather of them all that hasn't been surpassed yet is Miller's Japanese, is it just Japanese language? That has a great historical overview of the Japanese writing system. It's a bit condescending and, well, complainy about how overly complicated Japanese writing system is, especially when it comes to Old Japanese. There's this great quote here that's the all-time great quote about the old Japanese writing system. But yeah, it's really a amazingly thorough yet somehow also pretty accessible overview of Japanese writing. And really, since the 60s, there hasn't been much change in the general overview of the history of Japanese writing. When it comes to the more general stuff about writing and writing systems and stuff like morphography versus phonography, I'm really indebted to the work of my professor Sven Osterkamp and Gordian Schreiber, who work a lot on writing system classification and how Japanese and specifically Old Japanese figures into that whole discussion. If you want to get an overview of what the debate there is and what the problems are in that debate, I would recommend challenging the dichotomy between phonography and morphography. Phonographic and morphographic writing was what was it? And then the most recent article proposal for a structurable and expandable classification of writing systems, I think, by Osterkamp and Schreiber. Those are really, I think, great attempts at bringing structure into the study of writing. One thing that hopefully wasn't too jarring was the transcriptions and the grammatical analysis that I used. Because those weren't really the focus of the video, I decided to just kind of gloss over them. Yeah, I just kind of want to provide a bit of context here. As I already put into the video, I think the main guiding principle for both the transcription of Japanese and the morphological analysis is this here, Jens Rickmeyer's system as explained in this wonderful book, Japanische Morphosyntax, genau. Japanische Morphosyntax in German, Japanese morphosyntax. I think it only exists in German. It's pretty much only taught at my university, which makes it greatly accessible, obviously. Yeah, it's a bit of an arcane system of morphological analysis, but well, I'm obviously biased because I was taught this system for a long time, but I think it's the best system of analyzing modern Japanese grammar, and it's also greatly applicable to older stages of Japanese. And that's why I use it. It's the transcription itself is not that strange. It's just standard Japanese kunle transcription with the coda nasal written with that ñ instead of just an N, because it's a different phoneme than the N. Yeah, the morphological analysis, the system is different from both like things in the tradition of Japanese school grammar and from those more generative syntax inspired things that you often see in English language linguistic publications on Japanese. It's a pretty arcane system in some respects. Maybe in the future I will talk about it in a bit more detail, but as I said, it's not really relevant for the writing system too much. Of course, knowing that there's different morphemes that are represented morphographically is relevant, but not that relevant. Then, of course, also for the classical Japanese, there's also a classical Japanese. This is actually my classical Japanese textbook from which I took the classical Japanese poem. It's Introduction to Classical Japanese through the Hyakunin issue. That's also why I used that particular written Edo period version of that poem, because this is the particular version that Jens Rickmeyer used for his textbook on old Japanese, classical Japanese, that I learned classical Japanese through. And yeah, I could have also done the other things that I showed in that part. They're all kind of interesting, but I stand by this is a pretty good explanation of how pre-modern Japanese writing worked. The old Japanese transcription, meanwhile, is pretty run-of-the-mill. It's the index notation for the different vowels, which we will get to in like 2 videos, hopefully. And that's something that you can pretty much see everywhere. The Middle Chinese transcription is also pretty standard. That's the one by Baxter and Sagart, who are really the main authorities on reconstructing Middle Chinese and Old Chinese, at least outside of China. And yeah, it's a big list of reconstructed sound values that you can find online. Their transcription kind of avoids using IPA-like special symbols, and so you end up with some weird choices like this plus thing instead of the barred I. Many other linguists prefer to use those IPA-like symbols, but because this isn't really supposed to be phonetic, it's just supposed to be a abstract representation of the Middle Chinese phonology as it is explained in those lexicons and those rhyme those rhyme compilations that the Middle Chinese phonology, our understanding of Middle Chinese phonology, is based on. It's just supposed to be a representation of that. Man, I'm rambling. Yeah, if you want to learn more about Middle Chinese phonology and maybe even the strange yet beautiful world of Old Chinese reconstruction, I can only recommend the YouTube channel of Nathan Hill, who is a researcher in Chinese and Sino-Tibetan historical linguistics, who uploads a lot of lectures on YouTube, both his own lectures and also stuff from conferences. And his series on Middle Chinese and Old Chinese reconstruction, his multiple series actually, are, in my opinion, pretty great at explaining this otherwise pretty difficult to access subject. Then, of course, when it comes to the old Japanese specifically, the kind of grammatical terminology that I used was kind of all over the place. Like, we already had that part about like perfect, perfective. Then there's like future versus tentative or presumptive or whatever. There's also like what I called the adverbial. That's usually or often called the infinitive. When it comes to explanations of old Japanese grammar in English, you really have like 2 good resources. There's Fledesvig, whom I already mentioned, who has a lot on Old Japanese grammar. I disagree with a lot of that. That's why that's kind of the point where I really diverge from that book whenever I talk about the grammar. And then there's also Wovin's grammar of Western Old Japanese. I think the final version of that is from 2020, which I much prefer. I still think there's a lot of questionable stuff in there. There's a lot of weird speculative assumptions, which you kind of can't do without when you're talking about Old Japanese. It's a very weird language after all. But I still think like Wovin's grammar is just an amazing resource for looking at what kind of weird morpheme combinations exist and how they might be interpreted. In the English language, it's probably like the best choice. I also put a little note mentioning Mouton into the video, I think. Mouton's Japanese Language Through Time. I wouldn't recommend reading that book if you value your sanity. Also, a lot of the kind of reconstruction of Old Japanese to Proto-Japonic / pre-Old Japanese, that's kind of all outdated. So it's I just like that part about the future / tentative / presumptive / whatever. So in conclusion, the kind of grammar that I use for Old Japanese is a kind of idiosyncratic hodgepodge of Rickmeyer's system in addition to stuff I like about Old Japanese grammars. And the terminology doesn't agree with any of those, really. And that's just a thing that's common in linguistics in general, especially in historical linguistics and in linguistics of languages that aren't like standard average European or Indo-European or whatever, that just pretty much every researcher, every scholar uses his own terms for different categories, or even, well, they also don't agree on what those categories are in the first place. And so that's just something that you kind of have to deal with when you're talking about languages that aren't like Latin, where all this terminology comes from. So I hope again that it's not too confusing, and we will get to grammar at some point, sooner or later, probably. But first, like I said, it's gonna be phonology through the lens of my Yogana, and again, because I can't avoid going into not old Japanese stuff through the lens of hiragana. And I'm probably going to split that video into 2 parts because I really don't want to make another video over an hour again. I think that's too long for such an informational video. Like this isn't a video essay. Hope this one, despite its length, was interesting nevertheless. And stay tuned for the next one at dokudenpa.